In this lesson, we'll be changing our render settings. Okay, so this is where we left off in our last lesson. I've also added our other two graphs to your reference files folder and then opened them here in Cinema 4D so we can still look at our line and pie graphs as well as our bar graph. Okay, so let's get started by changing our render settings for the bar graph. So I'll come up here to Render, go to Edit Render Settings, and the first thing I want to change is our size. So I'm going to change that from the standard 800 by 600 to 1280 by 720. Okay, so that's going to make a big difference in the way that this looks in the end and the aspect ratio. Now let's go to our save settings and we'll figure out where we want to save these to. Now before we just start saving them somewhere, we'll probably want to create a folder inside of your reference files. So we'll come over here and click this browse button. And just here in your reference files folder, we'll go in, create a new folder, and we'll call this graph renders. And we'll go into the graph renders and we'll call this one bar graph. Okay, so you can click save on that. Now, if you want your ambient occlusion to be output as a separate pass, once we add that, we'll want to add our multi-pass, which is the next thing that we'll click on. But because we haven't set that up, we'll wait a second. Now, ambient occlusion is going to help us to get some really tight little shadows in certain areas that are have geometry very close together. So first we'll want to add the effect ambient occlusion, and then we'll want to go into our multi-pass and add ambient occlusion there if you want it output as a separate pass, which I usually like to do. So I'll click ambient occlusion and then we'll go into multi-pass and check that on. Then what we'll need to do is go back into our save tab and tell it where we want the ambient occlusion pass to save, or any other multi-pass images you may output. Also, I don't want it to be output as a PSD, so I would choose something like a TIFF for that. So we'll just choose TIFF here, and then we'll click this to tell it where we want it to go. So it's already in the reference files folder, already in graph renders, and again, I'll just name this bar graph because it's going to put the layer name as the suffix. So it will automatically add AO to bar graph. So it's okay for it to have the same name as our regular image save. Now I don't want it to be a multi-layer file, so I'm going to uncheck that. Now if you want to have an alpha channel, you could check that on, but it really wouldn't have anything output because we are adding our background, so we wouldn't really be able to see it because of our sky. So you would actually want to add object buffers if you wanted to be able to add maybe some kind of texture in post, which we're not going to be going through that process, so I'm not worried about checking on the alpha channel. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our output again. And right now that's set to current frame, which is fine. Let's go ahead and do a quick render into our picture viewer to see if the ambient occlusion is really making a difference on this particular look. Now, another thing you're going to notice is because we changed the size of our render, it changed the way that our camera is interacting. So you can see how now it looks much closer now that we've got that 1280 by 720 size. However, it can sometimes be hard to tell what it actually looks like whenever you're working in a smaller space like this. So again, let's take a look at the picture viewer and see if we need to edit the camera at all. So I'll hit Shift R to open up that picture viewer, and then that's just going to render the current frame that we're on. And you can see that if we go all the way to the side and all the way down, we are having this kind of fall off to the side. I am getting a nice little look here on the side where it appears that maybe the ambient occlusion is helping, on top of this area. So let's look, if we go into layer and choose multi-pass, you can see that this is what the ambient occlusion is adding to it. So if we didn't have that ambient occlusion turned on, we wouldn't get any of those nice shadows around our graph and around our numbers. So this actually looks pretty good. I don't really feel like I need to change those ambient occlusion settings at all, really, to get the effect that I'm going for, at least for the bar graph. So let's go back over to our regular image, and actually we will need to edit our camera a little bit, which really shouldn't be that hard. We don't need to much edit the camera rig, mostly just the camera. So on this last spot, let's just pull back a little bit, just maybe right in there, and then just kind of reposition that in the middle. And then we'll want to go into the coordinates of the camera and rewrite those keys. Then I'm going to come back in here, and by this time we were a little bit further back as well, and we'll move that a little bit also, rewrite those keys. And then here at the beginning, I think that's fine because we're not going to be too close to the coins geometry because they come in much later. So that's looking pretty good. And I'm not really noticing any kind of a boomerang effect. So I think that that will be okay. If you want to, though, you could go into your rotation settings in your camera rig, maybe take a look at the F curves and see if something is happening maybe that you don't like. So you can see how it kind of rotates down, and then we rotate. It feels like it might have kind of floats back over to the side, and it looks like that's not really coming from the rotation, even though it's a rotation type of movement. It's actually coming from the camera because that is what we have changed. So a way to get around this is to simply select that keyframe on the camera and delete it. And then what we can do is, let's make sure that we're only deleting this middle key. So select that one and delete it. So now we've still got our other two keys. And what we can do is just say right about here, we want to set another key, and then we can just pull it back. So go back into your camera coordinates, set a key here, and then we'll pull it back to that same frame 60. And now we do get a little bit of a boomerang, so we'll want to change the F curves in our camera. So you can see how this is similar to what we fixed before. We've just had to make a few adjustments for the sake of that new render size. And we also have a little bit on our Z as well. So we'll just grab that and pull it back in. Okay, so let's take a look at this. If we play back, and I think that looks great. So now we've adjusted that for the sake of that new size, and it was mostly just an adjustment to the camera, not to the camera rig. So what you'll want to do is go back in between lessons and change the render settings for your pie graph and your line graph to also have that 1280 by 720, and then adjust your camera. Now in our next lesson, I want to come in and show you something that we can start to edit on the pie graph. So we'll come back in the next lesson and play with our render settings a little bit as they relate to that specific graph.